Some people don't walk into a hotel. They walk straight into a moment that will quietly change everything that comes after it. At exactly 2:07 a.m. inside the Grand Harwick Hotel in downtown Chicago, Claire Bennett noticed something that did not belong to the rhythm of the night. The marble floors were empty, the chandeliers dimmed to a soft golden glow, and the front desk had settled into that quiet hum reserved for places that never fully sleep. Claire, 27 years old, worked the night shift as a waitress and occasional support staff, the kind of role that required her to see everything and be acknowledged by almost nothing. She moved through the lounge with a tray in her hand, her posture steady, her presence calm in a way that came from repetition, not luxury. That was when she saw him. A man sitting alone in the far corner of the lounge, wearing a dark coat that looked worn at the edges, his posture slightly leaned forward as if the chair itself was the only thing keeping him grounded. Beside him sat a small suitcase, scuffed and unremarkable, the kind you would expect from someone traveling with necessity rather than comfort. For a moment, no one paid attention to him, and that was exactly what made Claire pause. People who looked out of place in places like this usually tried to compensate with noise or confidence, but this man had neither. He simply existed there, quiet, observant, as if he was studying the building instead of occupying it. A security guard walked past and slowed for half a second, eyes narrowing just slightly before continuing on, dismissing him as just another late guest with bad timing. But Claire did not move away. Instead, she walked closer, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor breaking the silence between them. When she reached his table, she placed a glass of water down without asking if he had ordered anything. It was a simple gesture, nothing more than what she would do for any guest, but the man looked up as if no one had done that for him in a long time. His eyes were steady, neither cold nor warm, but tired in a way that suggested rest had not been part of his life recently. "You look like you could use this," Claire said softly, her voice neither intrusive nor overly familiar. The man studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, almost reluctant, as if accepting kindness was a decision he had to think about. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said quietly, his voice calm but layered with something unspoken. Claire glanced at the lobby behind him, where the night manager was now distracted with paperwork and the security guard had moved out of sight. "Most people who end up in hotel lobbies at this hour aren't," she replied, not unkindly. That answer seemed to land differently than expected. The man's gaze shifted slightly, as if recalibrating his understanding of her. Claire did not ask who he was or why he was there. Instead, she noticed the way his hands rested on the suitcase, protective but not defensive, and the faint trace of rain still clinging to the hem of his coat. After a brief silence, she leaned slightly forward and lowered her voice just enough to stay between them. "If you're waiting for someone, they're not coming down anytime soon. And if you're not, the lobby closes to non-guests after 3. The man exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he had already known but hoped to avoid. Then, almost unexpectedly, he asked, "Do you always treat strangers like they matter?" Claire paused for only a second before answering. "Only the ones who look like they've forgotten they do." For the first time since she had approached him, something subtle shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite surprise, but something closer to recognition. Outside, a faint wind pressed against the glass doors, and the hotel lights flickered softly in their golden patterns, as if the building itself was listening. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the kind of meeting that did not stay small for long. And somewhere deep in the quiet architecture of that night, a decision was already beginning to form that would soon make room 407 the most important number in the entire building. The silence between Claire Bennett and the man lingered longer than expected, not uncomfortable but weighted, as if the space itself was waiting to see who would move first. The man glanced briefly toward the reception desk where a night manager was flipping through paperwork with practiced indifference, then back to Claire as if measuring whether she was simply being polite or something closer to intentional. Claire, however, did not change her posture or her tone. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, as if this kind of moment was not unusual to her, even though something about him clearly did not belong to the predictable patterns of the Grand Harwick Hotel. After a few seconds, the man slowly closed the lid of his suitcase without locking it, a small gesture that suggested he was not worried about theft or exposure, only about being asked too many questions. "I am not trying to cause trouble," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a restrained fatigue. Claire nodded once, acknowledging the words without judgment. "Trouble usually announces itself louder than this," she replied, glancing briefly at the half-empty lobby. "Right now you just look like someone trying not to sit down on a world that is moving too fast." A faint exhale escaped him, almost like a restrained laugh, but it faded before fully forming. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then asked, "Do you always speak like that to guests who might not even have a room?" Claire considered the question carefully, then answered, "I speak to people based on what they do, not what they look like. Rooms do not define whether someone deserves to be treated like a person." That answer seemed to settle something in him, but also deepen his curiosity. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed from behind the front desk. The night manager, a sharply dressed man named Richard Halstead, approached with a forced professional smile that did not reach his eyes. His gaze landed immediately on the man in the worn coat. "Good evening," Richard said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "I am afraid the lounge is for registered guests only after midnight." The implication was clear, and Claire felt it immediately tighten the air. The man did not argue. He simply nodded slightly, as if he had heard similar sentences many times before in different places. Claire stepped forward half a pace. "He is not disturbing anyone," she said calmly. Richard turned his attention to her, irritation flickering just beneath his composed exterior. "Claire, we have policies for a reason. If he is not a guest, he cannot remain here indefinitely." The man raised a hand slightly, as if to intervene, but Claire spoke first. "He is waiting for a ride or making a call, I assume. Either way, he is not causing disruption. The lobby is not full." Richard hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance, especially not from someone in her position. The man finally spoke again, his voice even but quieter than before. "I was actually waiting to decide what comes next." The words hung in the air, simple but loaded with something neither Claire nor Richard could immediately place. Richard sighed, checking his watch. "Well, decisions need to be made elsewhere. We are a private establishment." Claire looked at the man again, and for the first time there was a subtle shift in her expression, not defiance but clarity. She turned slightly toward Richard. "Then I will take responsibility for him," she said. Richard frowned. "You are a waitress, not concierge. Tonight, I am someone who understands that no one ends up sitting alone at 2 in the morning in a hotel lobby unless something is already heavy enough," Claire replied evenly. A brief silence followed. The man studied her again, this time with a different kind of attention, not curiosity about her words, but recognition of intent. Finally, Richard exhaled in frustration. "Fine. 5 more minutes. Then he leaves the property." He turned and walked away, shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. When he was out of earshot, the man looked at Claire with something closer to genuine appreciation. "You did not have to do that," he said. Claire shrugged slightly. "Most people do not have to be defended. It just happens anyway." A faint pause followed before he spoke again. "If I told you I was staying in room 407, would that change how you see this situation?" Claire blinked once, not reacting immediately. That room number carried a certain reputation in the hotel, reserved, rarely used, always booked under special arrangements. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in recalibration. "Then I would say you should not be sitting in the lobby at all," she replied softly. The man nodded once, as if confirming something internally. "That is fair." He stood slowly, picking up his suitcase. "I think I have stayed in lobbies long enough." Claire watched him for a moment as he adjusted his coat. There was something about the way he moved that did not match the appearance he had chosen to present. It was not wealth or lack of it, but control, the kind that suggested he was used to rooms reacting to him rather than the other way around. As he started toward the elevator, he paused and looked back. "What is your name?" he asked. "Claire Bennett," she replied. He repeated it once under his breath, as if storing it carefully. Then he said, "Thank you for not treating me like I was already decided." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside. Claire remained where she was until the doors closed, watching the reflection of the lobby lights fade on polished metal. She did not know why, but something about that moment felt less like an ending and more like the quiet beginning of something that had not yet revealed its shape. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic whisper, leaving Claire Bennett alone in the lobby with the faint hum of the Grand Harwick Hotel settling back into its nighttime rhythm. For a moment she remained still, her gaze lingering on the polished floor where the man had stood only seconds before. There was no logical reason for her attention to stay there, no requirement in her job that demanded reflection, and yet something about him refused to dissolve into the usual memory of passing guests. Upstairs, the elevator ascended quietly toward the upper floors, passing levels of increasing exclusivity until it reached the restricted wing, where silence felt more expensive than the marble itself. Inside the elevator, the man adjusted his coat slightly, his reflection steady in the mirrored walls. He pressed no button, because the system already recognized him. When the doors opened, he stepped into a corridor that was noticeably different from the rest of the hotel. The lighting was softer, the carpet thicker, and the air itself carried a stillness that suggested fewer people ever reached this level. He walked without hesitation toward room 407, stopping only once in front of a discreet security panel. A brief scan confirmed access, and the lock released with a quiet click. Inside, the suite was spacious but understated, designed not for display but for observation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, where distant lights flickered like scattered signals across the night. The man set his suitcase near the entrance but did not open it. Instead, he stood near the window for several seconds, as if listening to the city more than looking at it. Down in the lobby, Claire resumed her duties, but her movements were slightly slower than before, almost imperceptibly distracted. She wiped down a nearby counter, checked a set of receipts, and greeted a late-arriving guest without error. Yet her attention occasionally drifted toward the elevator bank, as if expecting it to reopen for reasons she could not define. At approximately 2 hours past midnight, the hotel manager Richard Halstead returned from his office and approached Claire with a more measured expression than before. "He is gone," Richard said, glancing briefly toward the lounge. Claire nodded once. "He left quietly." Richard adjusted his tie. "Good. People like that tend to complicate things." Claire did not respond immediately. She placed a glass on the counter, then replied, "He did not seem like someone trying to complicate anything." Richard gave a short, dismissive nod. Everyone says that until they have to explain it to ownership. Then he walked away again, leaving Claire alone with the faint echo of his words. She glanced once more at the empty corner where the man had been sitting earlier. Something about Richard's phrasing felt too final, as if the man had already been categorized into a story that was not his own. Above her, in room 407, the man had finally opened his suitcase. Inside were no obvious signs of luxury or excess, only neatly arranged documents, a thin laptop, and a simple black notebook. He placed the notebook on the desk and sat down, staring at it for a long moment without opening it. On the first page, a single handwritten line was visible. "Do they treat people differently when they do not know who is watching?" He closed it again without writing anything further. Minutes later, he made a phone call, speaking only a few words before ending the conversation. Downstairs, Claire finished her shift checklist and prepared to leave her station. As she gathered her belongings, she noticed a small envelope placed near the edge of the counter, one that had not been there earlier. It was unmarked except for a simple room notation, 407. She hesitated before touching it, then carefully picked it up. It was light, almost empty, yet felt intentionally placed. She did not open it. Instead, she looked around the lobby. No one was watching. The security cameras continued their quiet rotation. The night had returned to its normal state, yet something about it no longer felt ordinary. Claire slipped the envelope into her apron pocket and finished closing her station. Outside the glass doors, the city remained awake in fragments of light and movement, unaware that something small but deliberate had just shifted inside one of its quieter buildings. And somewhere above her, behind a locked door on the 4th floor reserved for those who rarely revealed themselves, the man stood once again by the window, looking down at the entrance where she had been standing only hours before, as if already understanding that the night had not finished speaking. Morning arrived at the Grand Harwick Hotel without ceremony, the kind of Chicago sunrise that filtered through glass towers in pale gold fragments rather than warmth. Inside the lobby, the night shift slowly dissolved into the day shift, uniforms changing, voices adjusting, routines resetting as if nothing unusual had ever happened during the night. Claire Bennett stood behind the service counter completing her handover notes, her pen moving steadily across the page while her mind lingered on something she could not fully name. The envelope she had found earlier remained tucked inside her apron pocket, unnoticed by anyone else, but felt constantly present, like a detail the world had not yet explained. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, Richard Halstead returned to the lobby, accompanied by two senior staff members from operations. His expression was different now, more controlled, more formal, as if the night had been filed away into something already concluded. "Claire, a moment," he said, motioning her toward the side of the counter. She stepped away without hesitation. Richard folded his hands in front of him. "We need to discuss last night's situation." Claire met his gaze calmly. "There was no situation that I am aware of beyond a guest waiting in the lounge." One of the operations staff cleared his throat. "A guest who did not check in properly, and who accessed restricted areas according to preliminary review." Claire did not react immediately. Instead, she asked, "Did he cause any disturbance or damage?" Richard hesitated briefly. "That is not the point. It is the only point that matters in hospitality," Claire replied evenly. The air tightened slightly. Richard exhaled through his nose. He was not listed in the system under any standard reservation profile. Claire nodded once. Then perhaps the system was incomplete. That answer created a brief silence. Not defiant, not emotional, simply precise. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. "Regardless, we are documenting the incident. You should be aware that judgment calls involving unidentified individuals can create liability issues for the hotel." Claire accepted the statement without argument, but something in her posture shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in awareness. "Understood," she said. The conversation ended there, but as Richard and the others walked away, Claire's attention drifted briefly toward the elevators again. The envelope inside her pocket suddenly felt heavier, though it had not changed in weight. Later that morning, during a short break in the staff corridor, Claire finally opened it. Inside was not money, not a warning, and not a message of gratitude in the traditional sense. Instead, there was a single key. Card, matte black with no visible branding, and a small printed card with only one line of text. "Room 407 remains open for a reason." She stared at it for several seconds without moving. Around her, staff members passed through the corridor talking about occupancy rates, guest arrivals, and morning complaints, but none of it reached her in the same way it usually did. That room number was no longer just a designation on a floor plan. It had become a variable and something unresolved. At exactly 11:42 in the morning, Claire found herself standing again near the elevator bank, even though she had no scheduled reason to be there. She did not press the button immediately. Instead, she looked at her reflection in the polished metal doors, as if checking whether she still belonged entirely to the world she had been working in for years without question. When the elevator arrived, it opened empty. She stepped inside and hesitated only once before pressing the button for the fourth floor. The ascent was smooth and silent, each passing floor marking a subtle separation from the familiar structure of her day. When the doors opened, the corridor felt unchanged from the night before, yet somehow more deliberate, as if it had been waiting rather than simply existing. Claire walked slowly toward room 407, the key card held loosely in her hand. She stopped in front of the door. For a moment, she did nothing, only listened to the quiet hum of the building beyond it. Then she raised the card and slid it through the lock. The light turned green almost immediately. The door unlocked with a soft mechanical sound that felt unusually final. Claire opened it. Inside, the room was empty. No movement, no voice, no visible sign of the man from the night before. Only the same understated space, the same large window overlooking Chicago, and a desk positioned precisely in the center of the room. On that desk sat a folded document, placed carefully as if it had been waiting for a specific pair of hands. Claire stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The room felt colder than it should have been, not in temperature, but in expectation. She approached the desk slowly and looked down at the document without touching it immediately. Her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass surface of the window behind it, as if the room itself was observing her response. And in that quiet moment, Claire understood something she could not yet fully articulate. that nothing about the man she met in the lobby had been accidental, and nothing about this room had ever been meant to remain unvisited. Claire Bennett stood inside room 407 without moving for several seconds, as if the room itself might explain why she had been brought here instead of anywhere else. The silence was different from the rest of the hotel, heavier in a way that made every small sound feel intentional, even her own breathing. The folded document on the desk remained untouched, perfectly aligned with the edge as if someone had measured its placement down to the inch. Finally, she stepped closer and reached for it. The paper was thick, professional, the kind used for formal corporate communication rather than casual notes. She unfolded it carefully. The first line contained no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence. "You treated me like a person before you knew what I was worth." Claire read it once, then again, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully locked. Beneath it was a second page, a summary of observations from the previous night. Not surveillance in a threatening sense, but documentation of interactions, timing, and behavior. It described how she had offered water without request, how she had intervened during the manager's confrontation, and how she had spoken without adjusting her tone, even when questioned. At the bottom of the page was a final line. "Most people adjust behavior when status is unclear. You did not." Claire slowly placed the document back on the desk. Her eyes shifted toward the window, where the Chicago skyline stood still under a pale morning sky. For a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of test, but the structure of it felt different. Tests usually demanded performance. This felt more like observation after the fact, as if the decision had already been made and she was only now being shown the results. A soft sound came from the hallway outside the suite. Claire turned slightly, but did not step away from the desk. The door remained closed. After a brief pause, a second document slid through a narrow delivery slot beneath the entrance. Claire hesitated, then walked over and picked it up. This one was smaller, simpler, containing only a single page with a printed confirmation header. At the top, it read, "Property transfer authorization pending review." Her eyes moved down the page slowly. It referenced the Grand Harwick Hotel by name, including internal operational codes, valuation estimates, and ownership structure details. At the bottom, a single name appeared as initiating party, Ethan Calloway. Claire looked up immediately, her expression tightening slightly for the first time since entering the room. The name was not unfamiliar in financial news, though it was rarely associated with public appearances. It was associated with acquisitions, restructuring, and silent transitions of ownership in industries that rarely changed hands without notice. Before she could process the full weight of what she was reading, the door behind her unlocked again. Claire turned. Ethan stepped inside without urgency, as if he had been present the entire time in some capacity that did not require physical entry. He was dressed differently from the night before, now in a tailored suit that carried no excess detail, only precision. His gaze immediately found the document in her hand, then shifted to her face. There was no surprise in his expression, only confirmation that this moment had arrived exactly as expected. "You read it," he said calmly. Claire did not respond immediately. Instead, she held up the document slightly. "This is not something a guest normally finds in a hotel room." Ethan closed the door behind him. "You were never meant to find it as a guest." The words hung in the air without drama, only clarity. Claire placed the document back on the desk. "Then what was I meant to be?" she asked. Ethan studied her for a moment, not evaluating her reaction, but measuring consistency with everything he had already observed. "Someone who does not confuse appearance with reality," he said finally. Claire nodded once, slowly. "And the hotel?" Ethan moved toward the window, looking out over the city as if it belonged to him in a way that had nothing to do with possession. "The hotel is stable on paper, but unstable in practice," he said. "It has been managed by people who understand process, not people." Claire folded her arms lightly, still composed. "And last night was part of proving that." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Last night was not a test. It was a correction in perspective." Claire looked back at the document again. "You sat in the lobby without identification, without explanation, and observed how people responded." Ethan did not deny it. "Yes." A quiet pause followed. The kind of silence that was not empty, but full of unspoken conclusions. Claire stepped closer to the desk again. "And if I had treated you differently?" she asked. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Then this conversation would not be happening. There was no threat in his tone, only structure. Claire considered this for a moment, then asked, "Why room 407? Ethan looked toward the door briefly before answering. "Because it is the only room in the building that most people assume is already understood without ever seeing inside it." Claire absorbed that answer without interruption. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the decisions forming above it. Inside the room, nothing moved except the slow recognition that something foundational was being redefined. Claire finally spoke again, her voice steady. "What happens now?" Ethan returned his attention fully to her. "Now you decide whether you remain someone who serves rooms," he said, "or someone who understands how they are built." The words did not demand an immediate response, but they did not allow indifference either. Claire looked once more at the document, then at the window, and finally back at Ethan. And in that moment, room 407 stopped being a place and became a threshold. The air inside room 407 felt different after Ethan Calloway finished speaking, not because anything in the room had changed, but because the meaning of everything inside it had shifted. Claire Bennett stood near the desk, her attention moving between the document and the man who had placed it there, as if both now belonged to the same unresolved equation. The city outside continued its steady motion, Chicago traffic flowing in quiet streams far below, unaware that a single room on the 4th floor of the Grand Harwick Hotel was no longer operating under ordinary rules. Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but more deliberate than before. "If I choose not to stay in this conversation, what happens?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He moved slightly toward the window, his reflection blending with the skyline beyond it, as if he existed in both spaces at once. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "You return to your shift. You continue your routine. The hotel continues as it has." He paused briefly. "But you will know what you saw, and that part does not disappear easily." Claire absorbed the answer without interruption. She understood exactly what he meant. Some knowledge did not demand action, but it changed the way time felt afterward. She looked down at the document again, the formal language of property transfer still resting in silence on the page. "And if I stay?" she asked. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "Then you stop being only someone who observes how systems operate from the outside." A quiet tension settled between them, not emotional, but structural, like a door that had already begun to close behind one version of a life, while another remained open but undefined. Claire walked slowly to the window, standing beside him but not too close. From this height, the city looked ordered, almost intentional, as if every movement below was part of a design that most people accepted without question. "I have worked in hotels for 7 years," she said finally. "I know how guests are categorized, how service flows, how decisions are made without ever being explained." Ethan nodded slightly, listening without interruption. "But I have never been part of what determines those decisions." Ethan's gaze remained on the city. "Most people are not." Claire turned her head slightly toward him. "So, this is not about the hotel," she said. "It is about how those decisions are made. It is about who gets to make them," Ethan corrected calmly. The distinction settled heavily, but clearly. Claire returned her attention to the document. "And the man in the lobby last night," she said, "was that part of deciding?" Ethan did not deny it. "Yes." Claire exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition. "You wanted to see how people respond when they believe there is nothing to gain." Ethan finally met her gaze directly. "I wanted to see who still behaves the same when there is nothing to gain." The room fell into a deeper silence after that, one that felt less like absence and more like alignment. Claire moved back toward the desk and placed her hand lightly on the edge of the document. "You could have chosen anyone in this hotel for that," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No. Most people change tone when status is unclear. Some change posture. Some change intention. Very few do none of those things." He paused. "You did none of them." Claire studied him carefully now, not with suspicion, but with measured understanding. "And that is why I am here," she said. Ethan nodded once. "That is why you are here now." A faint notification sound came from Ethan's phone, breaking the stillness. He glanced at it briefly, then returned it to his side without reacting. Claire noticed, but did not comment. Instead, she asked, "What exactly are you proposing?" Ethan took a step away from the window and approached the desk. A transition, he said. Not immediately visible, not immediately public, but real. He gestured lightly toward the document. This hotel is one of several assets in a portfolio that has become disconnected from its original purpose. It functions, but it does not understand what it is functioning for anymore. Claire nodded slowly. And you believe I do? Ethan did not answer too quickly. I believe you see people before systems, he said. That is more valuable than most operational experience. Claire looked down for a brief moment, processing the weight of that statement. It was not praise in the conventional sense, but something closer to evaluation of utility and perspective combined. I am still a waitress, she said quietly. Ethan responded without hesitation. You are still someone who chooses how people are treated when no one is watching. The words landed differently than anything else that had been said so far. Claire looked back at the skyline, her reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, she thought about the previous night, the man in the worn coat, the way he had been observed without judgment, and the way that simple interaction had somehow expanded into this room, this conversation, this decision point that did not feel random. If I say yes, she said carefully, what changes first? Ethan answered with precision. Nothing visible to the guests, but everything in how decisions are filtered before they ever reach them. Claire turned back toward him. And what do you expect from me in return? Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if ensuring the answer would not be misunderstood. Consistency, he said finally. Not compliance. Not agreement. Consistency in how people are seen, regardless of context. The room returned to silence again, but this time it was different. Not uncertain, not heavy, but suspended. Claire placed both hands lightly on the desk, looking at the document, then at the key card that had brought her here, then finally at Ethan. The city outside continued without pause, but inside room 407, something irreversible had already begun to take shape. Claire Bennett did not answer immediately. The silence inside room 407 expanded until it felt like it had its own weight, pressing gently but insistently against the space between her and Ethan Calloway. She looked at him not as a guest, not as a stranger, and not yet as an authority, but as something in transition, something still being defined by the choices that had not yet been made. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but quieter than before. You keep saying consistency, she said. But consistency for who exactly? The guests, the staff, or the people who make decisions behind closed doors? Ethan did not look away. For everyone, he said simply. Claire nodded once, but her expression suggested she understood the weight of that word was far heavier than its simplicity. She turned toward the window again, the city stretching outward in layered grids of light and movement. People in hotels like this do not usually get asked to participate in anything beyond their job description, she said. We are trained to follow structure, not reshape it. Ethan moved closer to the desk, his tone unchanged. That is exactly why structure becomes predictable, and predictability creates blind spots. Claire glanced back at him. And you think I am a blind spot? Ethan considered the question carefully. I think you are a variable that does not reduce itself to assumption, he said. The answer lingered in the air, precise and deliberate. Claire returned her attention to the document again, then to the key card resting beside it. If I agree to this, she said slowly, I am still Claire Bennett. I am still a waitress on the schedule. Ethan nodded. Yes. And nothing changes publicly, she continued. No announcement, no shift in identity. Correct, Ethan said. Claire studied him for a moment longer, then asked, Then what changes? Ethan stepped closer to the edge of the desk. Access, he said. Not in the way people usually define it. Not status, not title. Access to decisions before they become visible consequences. Claire absorbed that without interruption. It was not a promise of power in the traditional sense. It was something more controlled, more restrained, something that existed before outcomes rather than after them. She exhaled slowly. And the hotel? She asked. Is it failing? Ethan shook his head slightly. Not failing, he corrected. Drifting. Claire frowned slightly. That sounds like a distinction without a difference. It is the most important distinction there is, Ethan replied. Failure gets attention. Drift does not. A brief silence followed. Claire looked down at the document again, then spoke more quietly. Why me? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her toward the city, as if the answer required distance rather than proximity. Because last night, he said, you did not adjust your behavior. Based on uncertainty, you did not change tone, posture, or intent when you did not know who I was. He turned back toward her. Most people unconsciously negotiate status. You did not. Claire nodded slightly, though her expression remained measured. That is not something I was aware I was being evaluated for, she said. That is usually how it works, Ethan replied. Claire looked back at the key card again. The matte black surface reflected nothing, offering no hint of what it represented beyond access itself. If I accept, she said carefully, I am stepping into something that I cannot fully see yet. Yes, Ethan said without hesitation. Claire nodded once more, this time slower. And if I refuse? Ethan's answer was immediate. Then nothing about your current life changes. He paused briefly. Except that you will know there was a version of it you chose not to enter. That sentence settled heavily, but without pressure. Claire turned away from the desk and walked slowly toward the window again. Outside, Chicago continued its rhythm, traffic lines shifting like silent patterns across the streets below. People moved through their day unaware of rooms like this one, unaware of conversations that did not appear in public records or daily routines. Claire placed her hand lightly on the glass. I have spent years watching people move through spaces like this, she said, always responding, never initiating. Ethan remained where he was, listening. And I never thought that would feel incomplete until now. A faint pause followed. Claire turned back toward him. This is not about becoming something different, she said. It is about understanding what I have been standing next to without seeing it. Ethan nodded once. That is accurate. Claire walked back to the desk and picked up the key card. She turned it once between her fingers, feeling its weight, its neutrality, its lack of explanation. Then she placed it back down. I will not leave my role immediately, she said. I will not disappear from my position. That was never required, Ethan replied. Claire met his gaze directly. Then I accept on one condition, she said. Ethan waited. Claire continued, her voice steady but precise. If I am to be part of anything that influences how this place operates, I do not observe people as data points. I observe them as they are. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than before, then nodded once. Agreed. The word was simple, but it marked something final in structure. Not transformation yet, but alignment. Claire placed her hand on the desk again, no longer on the document, but beside it, as if establishing presence rather than examining it. The room remained quiet, but it no longer felt like a threshold waiting to be crossed. It felt like a point where direction had already been chosen, even if the path beyond it had not yet revealed itself. The next morning inside the Grand Harwick Hotel did not feel like a continuation of the night before, but rather a carefully reset version of reality, as if the building itself had decided to behave as though nothing significant had occurred. Guests moved through the lobby with the same predictable rhythm, luggage rolling across marble floors, reception greetings exchanged at standard volume, and staff responding with practiced efficiency. Claire Bennett stood behind the service desk once again, her uniform unchanged, her posture steady, her presence indistinguishable at first glance from any other employee fulfilling a routine shift. But internally, something had already shifted in a way that no repetition could erase. The key card to room 407 remained secured in her personal locker, and the agreement she had made with Ethan Calloway now existed in a space that was not visible to anyone else in the hotel. At exactly 9:43 in the morning, a black vehicle arrived at the main entrance. It did not stop with urgency or hesitation. It stopped with precision. A man stepped out, followed by two individuals carrying folders instead of luggage. The front desk staff immediately adjusted their posture, recognizing without confirmation that this was not a typical guest arrival. Claire observed from a distance, not intervening, not reacting beyond attention. Within minutes, Richard Halstead was called to the lobby. He approached with the same controlled professionalism he always maintained in front of high-profile arrivals, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. The man from the vehicle spoke briefly with Richard, handing over a sealed document packet. Claire could not hear the words, but she recognized the structure of the exchange. It was administrative, formal, and final in tone. When the man left, Richard remained standing in place for several seconds longer than necessary, reading the contents again as if repetition might change meaning. Then he turned slowly toward the staff area. Claire returned her attention to her workstation, but she did not need to be told when Richard approached her desk. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Claire nodded once and stepped aside with him toward a less visible corner of the lobby. Richard did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked at her for a moment as if recalibrating a previous assumption. "There is a change in operational oversight beginning immediately," he said. Claire remained neutral. "What kind of change?" Richard hesitated before answering. "The hotel is now under interim review by external ownership representation." Claire absorbed that without visible reaction. "External representation," she repeated. Richard nodded. "They will be observing internal processes before any formal restructuring decisions are made." Claire understood immediately that the phrase was carefully chosen to avoid saying acquisition, transition, or replacement. She looked briefly toward the elevators, then back at Richard. "And staff?" she asked. "No immediate changes," Richard said, though his tone carried uncertainty beneath the words. "But there will be evaluations." Claire nodded once. "Understood." Richard paused, then added more quietly. "There is also a request for you specifically." Claire looked at him directly. "From who?" Richard hesitated again. "From the individual overseeing the review." Claire did not need clarification. She already knew. At precisely 10:32 in the morning, Claire received a discreet notification through internal staff communication requesting her presence in room 407. The message contained no explanation beyond timing and location. She did not respond. She simply acknowledged and continued her duties until her break window arrived. When she finally stepped into the elevator, the movement felt different from the previous night. Not uncertain, but defined. The elevator ascended with the same quiet efficiency, and when the doors opened, the corridor remained unchanged, yet somehow more present, as if it now registered her arrival in a way it had not before. Claire walked to room 407 without hesitation. The door opened upon access without delay. Ethan Calloway was already inside, standing near the window, his attention directed outward toward the city. He did not turn immediately when she entered. Instead, he spoke first. "They arrived this morning," he said. Claire closed the door behind her. "I saw." Ethan finally turned. His expression remained composed, but there was a shift in focus that suggested decisions were now moving from theory into execution. "The review phase has begun," he continued. Claire approached the desk, but did not sit. "Richard said external oversight," she replied. Ethan nodded. "That is the public structure." Claire studied him for a moment. "And the actual structure?" Ethan moved toward the desk and placed a single folder on its surface. "Transition Authority," he said. Claire looked down at the folder, but did not open it yet. "Meaning control?" she asked. Ethan did not correct her. "Meaning responsibility," he said instead. Claire finally opened the folder. Inside were operational charts, staffing hierarchies, financial summaries, and behavioral performance reports categorized in a way that felt more observational than administrative. At the top of one page, her name appeared. Not highlighted, not emphasized, but included among several personnel entries with notes describing consistency, decision response, and interpersonal behavior under uncertainty. Claire did not react immediately. She simply read. After several seconds, she closed the folder and placed her hand lightly on top of it. "This is more extensive than observation," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Claire looked up at him. "And now what?" Ethan stepped slightly closer. "Now it moves from observation to influence," he said. Claire held his gaze. "Through me." Ethan did not deny it. "Partially," he said. Claire exhaled slowly, not in resistance, but in understanding of scale. "You are changing how decisions are made inside the hotel," she said. Ethan corrected gently. "I am changing who is allowed to question how decisions are made." A brief silence followed. Claire looked back at the documents, then toward the window, then finally returned her attention to Ethan. "And what is my role in that?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "You remain where you are," he said. "But you no longer remain invisible to the process." Claire absorbed that carefully. Outside, the city continued its movement, unaware that structures within one of its buildings were quietly being redefined without announcement or disruption. Claire finally spoke again, her voice steady. "Then I will need to understand everything," she said. Ethan nodded once. "That is already assumed." The room remained still after that, not empty, but aligned in direction, as if both of them had already stepped beyond explanation and into execution. The final morning light over the Grand Harwick Hotel carried a different weight than any previous day, not because the building itself had changed, but because the structure of authority inside it no longer belonged solely to those who had managed it for years. Claire Bennett stood near the central service station, observing without interruption as subtle shifts unfolded across the lobby. Conversations were quieter, staff movements more measured, and even the front desk seemed to operate with an awareness that unseen evaluation had already begun. Richard Halstead remained present but less certain in posture, as if every decision now required an invisible layer of approval that had not existed before. At exactly 11:15 in the morning, Ethan Calloway entered the lobby from the private elevator. There was no announcement, no visible escort, only the calm certainty of someone whose presence no longer needed introduction. His arrival changed the room without any sound. Conversation slowed, then stopped, entirely for a brief moment before resuming in lower volume. Claire noticed it immediately, not as admiration or fear, but as recognition of behavioral pattern. People adjusted when they believed structure had shifted above them. Ethan walked directly toward the center of the lobby and stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not signal for attention. Yet within seconds, key staff members began to orient themselves toward him. Richard approached first, followed by two senior managers. Claire remained at a distance, observing rather than participating. Ethan spoke briefly, his tone measured and controlled. "Operational review begins today," he said. Not as disruption, but as clarification. No one responded immediately. The phrase itself carried weight that did not require expansion. Ethan continued, "Nothing changes in service expectations, only in how outcomes are evaluated." Claire understood immediately that this was not a takeover in the traditional sense, but a restructuring of accountability. She stepped forward slightly, not into the conversation, but into proximity. Ethan noticed her presence and shifted his attention toward her without breaking his address to the group. "Claire Bennett will be part of the internal observation framework moving forward," he said. The room did not react with surprise, but with recalibration. Claire did not respond verbally. She simply acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. Richard looked at her briefly, then back at Ethan, as if attempting to reconcile known hierarchy with new positioning. Ethan continued, "Her role is not managerial in title, but functional in influence." That phrase settled differently in the room. Not authority granted, but authority recognized through function. After a brief pause, Ethan concluded the briefing and dismissed the group without ceremony. Staff dispersed slowly, conversations resuming in fragments rather than continuity. Claire remained in place as Ethan approached her. "You did not react," he said. Claire replied calmly. "Reaction is usually for announcements." This felt like confirmation of something already in motion. Ethan nodded once. "Correct." They walked together toward the side corridor leading away from the main lobby. Their pace was unhurried, but intentional. "There will be resistance," Ethan said after a moment. Claire did not look at him immediately. "From staff?" she asked. "From structure," he corrected. Claire considered this. "Structure resists change even when it is outdated," she said. Ethan acknowledged that with a slight nod. "Which is why observation must remain consistent," he said. They stopped near a quiet section of the corridor where ambient noise from the lobby faded almost completely. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "You have been included because your responses do not fluctuate based on perceived hierarchy," he said. Claire responded without hesitation. "I do not see hierarchy as a measure of behavior," she said. "I see behavior as a measure of hierarchy." Ethan studied her for a moment longer than before, then said, "That distinction is rare in environments like this." Claire glanced briefly toward the lobby at the end of the corridor. "Environments like this train people to respond, not evaluate," she said. Ethan replied, "That is what we are changing." A brief silence followed. Claire then asked, "What is the next phase?" Ethan reached into his coat and retrieved a thin device, placing it into her hand. It was not a phone in the conventional sense, but a secure communication tool linked to internal review systems. "You will observe interactions without being visible in them," he said. Claire looked down at the device. "And report?" she asked. "And interpret," Ethan corrected. Claire raised her eyes slightly. "Interpretation is subjective. Only when it is unstructured," Ethan replied. You are here because your interpretation has been consistent under uncertainty. Claire did not argue. She simply accepted the device fully into her hand. Ethan continued. There will be moments where what people say does not match what they do. Your role is to identify those gaps. Claire nodded once. And if those gaps become operational issues? Ethan answered without hesitation. Then they are addressed before they scale. Claire understood the implication. This was not observation for record-keeping. It was observation as early intervention. She looked toward the lobby again. Staff were now fully dispersed, returning to normal rhythm, unaware of the structural layer that had just been added above their routines. Claire spoke quietly. Most people here will never know this is happening. Ethan replied. Most systems function best when they believe nothing is watching. Claire turned back to him. But something is watching. Ethan met her gaze directly. Yes. A pause followed, not uncomfortable, but definitive. Claire closed her fingers around the device. Then I will observe, she said. Ethan nodded once. And you will remain unseen while doing it. Claire understood that this was no longer a test or a transition. It was a position that existed only because she had already demonstrated she would not distort her perception based on proximity to power. She turned slightly toward the corridor leading back to the lobby. Ethan remained still for a moment before speaking once more. Claire, he said. She paused and looked back. Do not change what you see in order to make it easier for others to accept it. Claire held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once. I will not, she said. Then she turned and walked back toward the center of the hotel, where nothing appeared different on the surface, but everything beneath it had already begun to operate under a new and unseen clarity.